Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, How Do They Know That? Verifying Claims in the Age of Fake News with Jim Handman. I want to start by saying that this webinar is presented as part of the Age of Disinformation project. This is a project that looks to combat dis and misinformation in Canadian media through a compilation of training sessions, awareness-raising activities, and tool development for magazine media and media users alike. We acknowledge the support of the Government of Canada in undertaking this project. Today, we are delighted to have Jim Handman with us. Jim is Executive Director of the Science Media Centre of Canada, and before joining the SMCC in 2017, he spent 17 years as executive producer of the award-winning CBC Radio science program, Quirks and Quarks. During that time, Jim won numerous prizes for science journalism, including the prestigious Walter Sullivan Award from the AGU. He has also taught broadcast journalism at Ryerson University, was science writer-in-residence at the Journalism School of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and was the CanWest-Global Fellow in Media at Western University, where he taught a graduate seminar in science journalism. Jim is a frequent speaker on the topic of science and the media, and also conducts training workshops in communications for scientists in Canada and the US. So today, Jim will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the Q&A message board so that you can type in your questions for Jim. And we'll be recording this webinar, which will live on the Magazines Canada website. So if anybody here today is unable to stay for the whole hour, but would like to have a question answered, you can email it in the next hour to Kylie Pole at Magazines Canada. That's kpole, P-O-L-E, at magazinescanada.ca. And now, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Penny. And thanks to you and Magazines Canada for inviting me to give this webinar today. I'm a lifelong fan of magazines. Been reading New Yorker since I was a teenager, and I subscribe to it still today. Also subscribe to The Walrus. It's an outstanding magazine. I subscribe to Toronto Life, even though I don't live there anymore because they write such fabulous features. So I'm really pleased to be doing this webinar for Magazines Canada. And I should apologize just in advance. I am battling a bad cold, and I will try not to cough in a fit of coughing during the webinar. I've got my cup of tea beside me. But of course, since this is an evidence-based webinar, I will not be taking any echinacea or oregano oil or cold FX. And this is where I really wish I could see the audience, because I'm used to giving presentations to live audiences. It's really hard not being able to see you and see your reactions. I missed that, but we'll do our best. So this webinar grew out of Penny approaching me and saying that in this age now of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, it's more important than ever to use scientific thinking to assess various claims that are being made. And what I said to her initially is that I've been doing this since before I was a science journalist, and we just called it critical thinking. And I think critical thinking is the most important tool for any journalist, science journalist or other magazine editor or any kind of editor, is to apply critical thinking to virtually everything you hear and ask that key question: how do they know that? When someone makes a claim, when someone makes a statement, just asking the simple question, well, how do they know that? I think will lead you down a path away from disinformation and fake news towards more facts, evidence, and data. So starting probably maybe about 15 years ago, I was part of a group that presented a training workshop at CBC that we pioneered on critical thinking. And we tried to indoctrinate our colleagues at CBC in both news and current affairs, radio and TV, into thinking, applying critical thinking skills to everything they approached. And back then, our main concern was spin. And spin is when people have an agenda and they put a spin on their statements. They put a spin on their claims They're trying to get you to buy into their agenda. And spin and PR were starting to really rise about 15 years ago. And over the past 15 years, PR has really overtaken journalism. I think 15 years ago, there were 3 journalists to every PR person. Today, there are 5 PR people to every journalist. The tables have flipped dramatically. And of course, PR people have an agenda, and they do try to spin journalists. So that's where a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today originated in my critical thinking courses. But today, with the rise of fake news and disinformation, it's more than just spin. It's now actually deliberately planting false information, which goes beyond just spinning the news to your agenda. So we're going to talk more about how they know that as we go along this afternoon. But I wanted to start with a very interesting story that I just saw this summer, came out in July in Journalist Resource, which is a wonderful online resource for journalists. And it was a study they did. It was actually not a study. It was just an opinion poll of their readers asking if they could spot flawed research. And 53% of the journalists who responded said they weren't sure they could actually spot flawed research. So here's the graph of the questions they asked. And it turned out that only 46% of the respondents said they were very confident they could distinguish between high quality research and questionable research. And you can see that 53% were only somewhat confident or not very confident. So that kind of tells you something about the landscape today when so many journalists aren't confident that they can even tell the difference between high quality research and questionable research. One of the main reasons is that journalists are innumerate. And for those who aren't familiar with the word, it's just illiterate except with numbers. And the truth is, something, I can't remember the exact number, but something like 99% of journalists in North America have a liberal arts background, and only about 1% have a science background. And many journalists did not do well in math or didn't care about math. And this turns out to be a huge problem because numbers are part of almost everything in our life. And I'll talk about that some more. Here's a story from 2006 from the National Post. And it was a story about the Liberal Leadership Convention that was happening at the time when Stéphane Dion defeated Michael Ignatieff. And hands up anyone who can even remember who Stéphane Dion was. But anyways, these leadership conventions are very complicated. The math is very complicated in terms of the last person drops out and their votes are split between the others. And as you see from the headline, the insiders were waiting for Mansbridge to do the math. Well, that's a big problem because Mansbridge confessed admirably. I don't know why it's admirably, but this is a quote from the story. None of us were very good at math. That's why we became journalists. I was just shocked at the time when I saw this story that Mansbridge would be proud of the fact that he's not good at math, and that's why we became journalists. Because, as I said, math is part of almost every story. Math, statistics, analysis of data is key to so much journalism. And to me, this was a shocking admission by Peter Mansbridge. Also on the panel with him on the National was Susan Risley from The Citizen, who also said, "I tune out when I hear the math." Now, you got to think about this for a moment. These people were hosting a special TV broadcast on CBC The National, analyzing the results of the leadership poll, which is a story 100% about the numbers. And Susan Riley said, "I tune out when I hear the math." So this kind of just sets the stage for you about what's wrong with many of the journalists today trying to grapple with the difficult stories that we're faced with, that they tune out when they hear the math. Now, there's lots of other problems, of course, with journalists today. Apparently, some of them tuned out in geography class as well, Hong Kong and Brazil there. This is a screenshot from NBC Nightly News. This is not from some cable community program. It's from NBC Nightly News, where apparently the people there not only are bad at math, they're actually bad at English as well. Ironically, this story was about a survey of how students around the world were doing in various school subjects, and the Americans came 21st in science. not surprisingly. This is one of my favorite corrections from the New York Times. I love looking at corrections because they're often hysterical. This was an article about wave piloting the Marshall Islands that misstated the number of possible paths that could be navigated without instruments among the 34 islands. It's 561, not a trillion. We really have to wonder how they made that mistake. The answer is 561, and they said it was a trillion. And my favorite slide of all time, I use this slide in every presentation I give because I think it touches on so many issues. This was the tragedy of the Columbia shuttle explosion, killed the entire crew. And according to this screenshot from CNN, the shuttle was traveling nearly 18 times the speed of light. Now, hands up, everyone out there, what is wrong with that headline? Yes, okay, I see you there in Winnipeg. You put your hand up. You're right, because, in fact, it's impossible for anything to go faster than the speed of light. The speed of light is a constant. This was proven by Einstein. It's been upheld. Nothing in the universe goes faster than the speed of light. Of course, this thing exploded if it was going 18 times the speed of light. Of course, what they meant was 18 times the speed of sound. Now, this could look like just a simple mistake made by the Ion editor who was typing rapidly during a live broadcast. But I actually think if you took this into any major newsroom in Canada or United States and asked them what's wrong, I bet you that 90% of journalists would have no idea. Because I think 90% of journalists would have no idea whatsoever that there's a difference between speed of light and speed of sound. So, now this is a GIF, which I hope will work. There we go. Okay, it goes along quickly, but I'll try to bring it up to speed for you. This is looking at causes of death. Now, the actual causes of death, according to the Centers for Disease Control, heart disease and cancer are the two leading causes of death. But if you search the media, the leading causes of death appear to be homicide and terrorism. Now, if you look at the actual causes of death, homicide and terrorism aren't even listed. But if they look at coverage in the New York Times and the Guardian headlines, most people in the world are dying from homicide and terrorism, when in fact they're dying from heart disease and cancer. I think this is a really interesting illustration of how the media has their own agenda and what they choose to focus on, and how that's really often a very distorted picture of reality. I'll just leave that up for another moment there. As you see the Google searches, cancer is number one because that's what people are worried about. But the fact the media is so focused on homicide and terrorism, when in fact those are minor causes of death, minuscule compared to what heart disease and cancer does. And this is the pocket guide to bullshit prevention. This is from my friend Michelle Nijhuis. She's an American science writer, brilliant writer. She's written for the New Yorker and New York Times Magazine. And she put this together many years ago. And you notice you can cut it out and put it in your pocket because it's your pocket guide. And it's simple 3 questions you should ask to find out whether someone's telling you bullshit or not. Who is telling me this? How does he or she know this? Given 1 and 2, is it possible that he or she is wrong? If the answer is yes, find another unrelated source. Repeat till the answer to 3 is really effing unlikely. Until the process is complete, assume bullshit. I really like this. Obviously, it's oversimplified, but in some ways, Michelle really has hit this on the head, which is what I said from the beginning. How did they know this? And then, is it possible that they're wrong? So you find another unrelated source to confirm whether they're right or wrong, and you keep looking for that source until the answer to, is it possible they're wrong, is really effing unlikely. Then you have something you can depend on. And you can cut this slide up and stick it in your pocket. This is mostly for people covering health stories specifically, and I don't know how many of you do. but it's from my friend and former Ryerson student, Julia Balluz, who's now leading health journalist in the United States working for Vox. And this is just a reminder that not all studies in health are equal, that some have much more validity and some have much stronger conclusions than others. I'm just going to skip by this for now, but that's on the Vox site. So along these lines, taking all this into consideration, this past summer, just in August, 24 researchers, leading American researchers, came together and they came up with some key concepts for making informed choices. And they were looking mostly, once again, at medical choices. But a lot of what they came up with are really key ideas that I think you can apply to all sorts of different areas of journalism. And they turned this paper in Nature into a website called That's a Claim. And I believe it's that'saclaim.org, where they come up with some key concepts for thinking critically about health claims. And these are directed both at the general public and at journalists covering health. So I'm just going to dive into a couple of these in detail. And the first category, whenever you hear something, and once again, as I say, this doesn't have to be about health. This can be about any claim that someone makes. If it's too good to be true, it's probably not. So the first example of too good to be true is 100% safe. There's nothing that is 100% safe. We just don't have anything that's 100% safe. And if someone says that, then it's probably too good to be true. Things can be extremely safe. Things can be tested and proven to be safe in almost all circumstances. But when you hear someone say 100% safe, I would beware. Same thing with 100% effective, also too good to be true. Some things are rarely 100% effective. Next category after too good to be true is faulty logic. There's lots of data. Well, more data is not necessarily better data, whatever the source. And that's just something to keep in mind, is that just having more data doesn't prove that something is right. Next faulty logic is a study shows. I'm going to spend some time on this because this is the #1 transgression by the media in relation to science and medical coverage, and in terms of coverage of all scientific medical claims, and in relationship to any study about anything. A study shows. Any single study, which in technical terms is an intervention comparison, any single study that shows that something is either good or bad doesn't mean that it's good or bad. A single study cannot give you a definitive answer. And yet, the media is really fast to jump on every study that comes out and report it as though this is the last word. And here's what this leads to. It leads to aspirin linked to cancer risk one day, and aspirin cutting your cancer risk the next day. Coffee raising your cancer risk one day, and coffee cutting your cancer risk the next day. Chinese medicine raises your cancer risk one day, and maybe Chinese medicine will cure your cancer the next day. Taking the pill raises your cancer risk one day. But taking the pill reduces your cancer risk the next day. And finally, beer and wine give us cancer. Wait a minute, having a pint of beer protects against cancer. So I could go on and on like this for the entire hour because I have thousands of examples of this where the media jumps on one single study and says, and these are all actual headlines, by the way. These are real headlines from real, this one's from the Daily Mail, you can see where it's from. Fine. So the people at Vox, once again, put together this really handy chart looking at the fact that everything we eat both causes and prevents cancer. Every red dot on this chart represents a single medical study. On the left, it protects against cancer. On the right, it causes cancer. So, if we look at wine, there's 2, 4, 6 studies show that it protects against cancer, and 3 studies show it causes cancer. If we look at eggs, we've got 3, 4 that show it protects, and 4 or 5 that shows it causes. And just go down the chart, the number of studies on each side is almost equal. So you just cannot grab one study and have a headline that says a pint will protect against cancer, because we have no idea. Along these lines, some scientists looked into this. This is, by the way, after the Shuttle Columbia slide. This is my favorite slide. New study says studies are wrong. This actually was a real study that came out in 2015 in Science magazine, which is one of the most prestigious magazines, in which some scientists looked at estimating reproducibility of psychological science. And they're specifically looking at psychological sciences. Psychological science has had a real crisis in recent years because scientists have not been able to reproduce or replicate the majority of the findings from these studies. So these are studies that, once again, get huge coverage in the media, but when scientists try to follow up and reproduce the study or replicate it, they cannot replicate the findings. The findings are different when they redo the study, calling into question the original results, of course. This is a quote from that study where the team tried reproducing 100 psychology studies that had been published in top US journals, but only 39% came out with the same result as the initial report. So that meant that 60% of the studies could not be reproduced. They could not come up with the same result. But sure enough, those studies probably got tons of coverage in the media because they were flashy and they were controversial, and people like psychology studies, but the studies were not reproducible and therefore probably not valid. Which leads us to the second thing, and this is similar in some ways to the single study syndrome, and that's associated with. I'm just going to take a sip of tea. I think the scotch and the tea really helps a lot. So this is one of the big crimes of the media in my eyes, which is confusing causation and correlation. Causation means one thing directly and positively causes something else. Correlation is one thing is linked to another thing or associated with it, but does not cause it or cannot be proven to cause it. Now, the media loves jumping on these stories. Most biomedical research shows a link between one thing and another. It's really, really difficult to prove something absolutely causes something else. The best you can usually do is that it's strongly associated, it's strongly linked to this. We think this might cause that, but it's almost impossible to prove something directly causes something else. But the media always, I shouldn't say always, the media very often confuses that correlation or association with causation. Which leads to this headline: Science Covering the News is pretty likely to be overturned. And this is about poor replication on biomedical association studies. So this is probably the greatest culprit in this area. And this is all those headlines I showed you before. That was biomedical association, where something causes cancer or doesn't cause cancer. And we know that when they tried to replicate those studies, the results were extremely poor. So they looked at a study from 2003 about how stress and genetics are linked to depression. It garnered 50 newspaper stories, which is a lot of coverage. But the newspapers never covered the 11 subsequent studies that failed to replicate this association. And this is very, very common. A study comes out that says, coffee causes cancer, or in this case, depression's caused by your genes. But there's subsequently a dozen studies that disprove that link or are unable to replicate that link. But the media doesn't cover those stories. So people are left with the original story, yeah, depression's all in your genes. When in fact, there were 11 subsequent studies that could not replicate that association. This, once again, is a serious failure of the media. And this one actually cuts across lines, not just science and medicine, but I think for all sorts of areas that journalism covers. And it worked for me, the anecdote. And we have a saying in science that the plural of anecdote is not data. It doesn't matter how many anecdotes you collect, that is not the equivalent of evidence. And this is one the media falls for the most because we like telling stories. I mean, I worked in radio for 35 years. I told stories. That's what we do on the radio, and it's what most journalism, the best journalism, certainly magazine journalism, is all about storytelling. So we like personal experiences. Even in science journalism, we often look for the personal story as a way into the science. So the personal anecdote is very powerful. It's powerful to the readers, it's powerful to the journalists. Editors love anecdotes. Unfortunately, anecdotes aren't evidence. And probably one of the key examples of this came in 2015, the front page story that the Toronto Star did about Gardasil. Now, Gardasil is a vaccine against HP virus, which causes cervical cancer. And it has been extremely successful in terms of battling the cancer and preventing HPV. But the Star splashed this huge investigation across the front page about the wonder drug's dark side, where they found since 2008, this was in 2015, so they found in the previous 7 years, at least 60 Canadians, and you notice that's in red, highlighted, experienced debilitating illness after getting the inoculation. And patients and parents say the incidents point to the importance of full disclosure of the risks of the virus. Well, this is a prime example of anecdote overriding evidence, because in fact, there was zero evidence in any of the 60 cases that could prove that the vaccine had anything to do with the illness these people suffered. There was no documentation to show whether they had the illness before they got the vaccine. There was no documentation to show when the debilitating illnesses began. There was zero evidence to link the vaccine to these individual anecdotes. The scientific evidence on Gardasil is extremely strong. It's been one of the most effective vaccines to come out in a long time. The side effects are extremely small, and there's been no evidence and no cases of debilitating illness at all. But the Star was caught up in these women's very heartbreaking anecdotes. These women suffered really terrible illness and disease, but we've no idea why that happened. And the public editor of the Star, Kathy English, came out with a really damning condemnation, which we had here, which the Star published to their credit, in which she said that when it comes to health and medicine, the standards of journalism demand that evidence-based science be given proper weight over emotional anecdotal evidence. In matters of life, death, and public health, the science matters. And this was a case where it wasn't just about these 60 women. This was a case of the impact their story could have on public health in Toronto and across Canada. Because as we know, the anti-vax movement is a great threat to public health. Here was a major newspaper in Canada with a major investigation calling into question the safety of an important vaccine, thereby threatening public health. And I think that Kathy English really nailed it here, saying that, the standards of responsibility expected in any journalism requires that evidence-based science be given proper weight over the emotional stories of individuals. No matter how powerful those individual weight over the emotional stories of individuals. No matter how powerful those individual stories are, they are not evidence. And I should have added, by the way, that after the Star printed that story, 100 of the leading epidemiologists and public health officials in Canada wrote a really scathing letter to the Star demanding they retract the series. And this turned out to be probably one of the biggest black marks the Star has ever had for an investigative series. And they did retract the series and apologized for it. And one more, recommended by experts. Well, just because someone's recommended by experts doesn't mean anything, because I'm very critical of press releases and the exaggeration in a lot of press releases. And a lot of press releases have an agenda, but so do a lot of scientists. And just because the scientist makes a claim doesn't mean it's true, because these scientists who publish these studies may have all sorts of ulterior motives for exaggerating their claims and their results. They might be looking for fame and fortune. They want to impress their peers. They're looking for money to further their research. Or in many cases in biomedical research, they're looking for investors because they want to privatize their research and make a lot of money. So you really have to beware. Just because the scientist who wrote the study makes an exaggerated claim does not mean it's true. Now, just going to switch gears here for a moment, because we do find ourselves in the midst of a federal election campaign. So those of you who have nothing to do with editing stories about science or medicine might be looking at dealing with stories about the upcoming election. And even outside the election, opinion polls come up all the time. Polling is huge in Canada now. We see polling stories on the front page all year, irrespective of election or not. So here's 11 key questions to ask when you're analyzing the results of a poll. Who conducted it? Not all pollsters are equal in their methodology and how reliable they are. Who paid for it? Most polls are paid for by someone. You want to know who that was. Did they have an interest in it? Follow the money, always a good idea in journalism. How were people chosen to participate? Was it truly random selection, or is this a specific subset of people that they wanted to target? How was it conducted? Was it a random telephone poll? Did they include cell phones? Cell phones have really thrown a wrench into polling, because if you only do landlines, you're getting a very specific older skew in the population. What's the margin of error? I'm going to come back to that. Were the participants compensated? Once again, follow the money. Who answered the questions? How many people responded? Can the results be generalized? What did the pollsters actually ask? What might have gone wrong? These are really key questions. These are, by the way, on the Journalist Resource website. Once again, fabulous website for journalists. I said I'd come back to margin of error. Margin of error is really, really important. And it's something that most journalists don't understand and don't look at. But look for the margin of error. The poll will always tell you what it is and report it. The larger the margin of error, the greater the likelihood that the estimate will be inaccurate. Make sure a candidate really has the lead before you report it. So, if the poll shows that Trudeau's at 40% and Scheer is at 38%, plus or minus 2%, 19 times out of 20, that means that Trudeau is anywhere from 38 to 42, and Scheer is anywhere from 36 to 40. In other words, if Trudeau's at 40 and Scheer's at 38 with a plus or minus 2%, they are statistically tied. You cannot say that Trudeau is ahead in the polls, because he's not. There is a margin of error. There's always a margin of error. The larger the margin of error, the less likely it's accurate. And this one, you see this every day with a poll that shows, one of the candidates ahead by 2% with a margin of error of 2%. And they say, Trudeau's leading in the poll. He's not. The headline is, the leaders are tied in the polls. Note that there's real trends, but mistaken claims of a trend, once again relating to margin of error. Watch your adjectives, always a good advice for journalists. Keep in mind that the margin of error for a subgroup of the sample will be even larger. Use caution when comparing results from different polls and surveys, especially those conducted by different organizations. So we've got Ipsos and we've got Reed and we've got Ecos. They all use different methodology and they all use different ways of polling. And you've got to be really careful to say, you know, Trudeau was ahead in the Angus Reid poll, but behind in the Ipsos poll, because they're using different methodology. It's very difficult to compare the results in those different polls. So I just threw that out there now because it's extremely topical and it might be of use to people. And then I want to come to, this is kind of coming back to my, how do they know that? The police are kind of notorious for throwing out statements that are not backed up by any data or evidence whatsoever. And I think journalists sometimes have a tendency to take statements by the police at face value. I think we don't question authority enough, particularly police. And this is my favorite one because it comes up every single year in every city in Canada. And this one is from Thunder Bay, where the police say impaired driving is at an all-time high. Now, how did they know impaired driving is at an all-time high? Because they arrested a record number of people, 178. But maybe the rise in impaired driving arrests has nothing to do with an actual rise in impaired driving. Maybe it's just stepped up enforcement. So in other words, if you increase your RIDE program, if you put more police out on the street, if you stop more cars, you'll probably find more drunk drivers. It does not mean that there are more drunk drivers in the population. It does not mean that your citizens are driving drunk more often. It just means you've stepped up enforcement. If you step up enforcement, you will catch more people. You see this as well with guns, where the police will say, you know, there's twice as many handguns on the street in Toronto because we seized twice as many as we did last year. Well, maybe they're carrying out more raids. If you carry out twice as many raids, you will probably catch twice as many guns. It does not mean there are twice as many guns in the population. And so this is just one, once again, how do they know that? You've got to really keep this stuff in mind and think critically about these kind of claims that are made. And I think I'm going to wrap up here now with just a warning to think critically, to question. I think it's one of the things that scientists do the best, is and journalists, I mean, should follow scientists in questioning everything. Question people, question claims, think critically about what you're reporting, and you know, as they used to say on Hill Street Blues, be safe out there, people. Thank you very much.
That's great, Jim. Thank you so much. Lots of a lot of things to think about there, for sure. We've opened the Q&A manager so that if anybody has a question for Jim, feel free to type it in. You'll see it in the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and we will pose the question to Jim here. And while we're waiting for a few questions from the audience, Jim, I'd love to ask you a few questions myself. This is such an interesting topic and so relevant today. I personally was very glad to see that there were more red dots on the wine protects cancer side of the chart than the wine causes cancer.
Me too.
Yeah. I've heard the terms misinformation and disinformation. Do you make a distinction between the two?
Not really. I mean,
No.
I think in general, disinformation is deliberate. I mean, I think you launch a disinformation campaign to deliberately plant false information. in order to sway people. Yeah, I'm actually not sure when people talk about misinformation, it may not be as deliberate as disinformation.
Yeah, I think that was my understanding of it, that, something might have started out being true, but by the time it gets amplified, say to a different region, it's not true in the different region. So,
Yeah, I think misinformation is, I think people read a lot of stuff on the internet that's not true, of course. And I think they pass it on their Facebook feed, and I think that's misinformation. I don't think there's any agenda, and I don't think they're trying to fool people. They're just passing along information that's just wrong, and that they're not aware that it's wrong. Whereas, as I say, disinformation would be a deliberate campaign, such as we saw during the U.S. election, where people were deliberately planting false information.
Yeah, and that's a great point about, the ability to share information through our social networks these days. How much do you think that contributes to the spread of inaccurate information?
I think it's the number one cause, to be honest. I remember when I first taught my critical thinking course at CBC, the whole scandal around Andrew Wakefield and his discredited study in the Lancet that showed a link between the MMR vaccine and autism had just kind of broken. That scandal had broken, and the Lancet had retracted his study, and there was a huge uproar over it in England and here. And at the time, the anti-vax movement in Canada was really about 12 people in the Slocan Valley of BC, and we just dismissed them as crackpots, and they hadn't, this was before the internet, frankly, and they had no way to reach out and spread their lies and disinformation about vaccines and autism. Well, of course, today the anti-vax movement is huge worldwide, and it's almost entirely due to Facebook and other social media, which has allowed those people to spread their message far and wide, endangering public health around the world, frankly. So yes, I see it as a real danger, and we've seen how social media was a danger during the U.S. election and during Brexit, and concerns about our own upcoming election. So yeah, the world's really changed since I started talking about this, and not for the better.
Mm-hmm. And it seems, I was interested in your discussion of your gift there, where, heart disease and cancer were the leading causes of death, but homicide and terrorism seemed to be the leading cause, even though they were minor compared with heart disease and cancer. And so it seems like journalists can shape our perspective not through mistruths, but through an emphasis of coverage. That if they're covering it more, it appears to be more true. Is that what you were saying there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the media has a huge responsibility in terms of shaping public opinion, because if you look at that GIF once again, if you look at that chart, if you just read the headlines in the New York Times and the Guardian in England, you would think that most people in this world are dying from terrorism and homicide, when in fact those are minor causes of death compared to the actual causes of death. So yes, it does distort reality. Crime stats is an area where this, once again, the police love to hold news conferences and pull up the crime stats to kind of tell you that, for instance, Toronto's riddled with guns and is much more unsafe than it used to be, and therefore we need more police and we need a bigger budget. But actually, if you look at the actual crime stats, crime has gone down in Toronto virtually every year since 1970, and it's at an all-time low. The gun violence of late in Toronto is troubling, and there's no question that is up, but overall crime is way down. Break-ins, assaults, carjackings, robberies, all crime stats are down dramatically over the past several decades. But if you just read the newspaper, you would think that, you know, Toronto is New York in 1965, a hellhole. So I think you have to be really careful about how you use, how the media reports these stories and reports these stats.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think that people, you know, can we rely on readers to understand that, you know, what they're is? I'm sorry, I'm not asking this properly. Do you think that this is why people are starting to mistrust media? That you can't always read, you know, you can't always believe what you read in print isn't a new saying. But do you think that people are less inclined to trust media these days?
Well, we know for a fact that trusted media is down because we've got surveys that show that. And um, I'm, you know, that's not my expertise. I don't know. I don't really know. I think there's so many factors why that's true. I just think it's sad that trusted media is down because 'cause I think a reliable, trustworthy media is a cornerstone of any democracy, and I'm sad that people have lost trust in the mainstream media.
Hmm. We have a few questions here from the audience. One is, are there
What's wrong with the
any?
audience? Oh, oh, sorry, I can't see the questions on the Q&A manager. So go
No, no.
ahead.
So I'll let you know what the questions are. And so the first one is, are there any recommended resources for understanding statistics and data? So, and
Yes.
the second one, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Excuse me, I finished my tea and the coughing is coming on. Um,
Oh,
so this website, there's actually a bunch of websites. The website I mentioned, which is journalistresource.org, no apostrophe, just journalistresource.org, has all sorts of resources there for understanding stats and polling and all sorts of stuff like that. So that's a really good place to start. I like that website a lot. I think if you Google statistics for journalists, there's quite a few other sites that come up. I don't have them off the top of my head, but I think there are quite a few resources online. I think the Poynter Institute has some online as well. Poynter Institute is a great online resource for journalists. I think the Pew Research Institute might also have some resources online.
great. So that first one was journalistsresource.org.
Yep,
Okay, and
journalistsresource.org. Yep.
good. How can magazine publishers and creators best counter disinformation? I know you had
Do you
your
mean in the
sort of,
world at large?
I think when they're, I suspect that this means, you know, when they're doing their own research. Um, Is there, I guess, you had mentioned you sort of had a tip sheet at the end. Um, are those the key ways that you can kind of avoid getting tangled up in disinformation?
Um, I think if you go back to that, you know, the pocket bullshit detector
Mhm.
was not a bad way to start. You know, who is saying this? How do they know it? And is there any chance they might be wrong? And keep talking to other sources until you can say with certainty they're not wrong. I think it really is, you know, it really is about making that extra phone call, which um, I think, you know, I hate to generalize about younger journalists, but just my experience working with younger journalists, both teaching journalist at Ryerson and working with him at CBC Radio, I think there's often a reluctance to kind of, or a tendency to send out one email and then wait for that person to get back to you. But I think if you really want to be sure of your facts, I think you just got to, you know, as Michelle said in that bullshit detector, just keep calling people, just keep finding more sources until you can say with 100%, or not 100%, but say with great confidence, yes, the claim by that person is most likely right. I think that's really a place to start. How do they know it? And find someone who can back that up. Mm-hmm. Don't just take claims on face value would be my, you know, and the same thing I was trying to say there about the police. Just because the police say that drunk driving's up, how do they know that? Well, they know it because they've arrested more people. Well, have you arrested more people because there's more drunk drivers? Or have you arrested more people because you're looking more? So it's really, how do they know that? And who can back up that claim? What are the stats? What are the evidence? What's the data?
And I would think there's value in spending time on doing that when you have the time. You know, sadly, it seems that there has been a decline in fact-checking in all media. And
Yep.
I wonder if it's because information has to get out so quickly. Everybody's vying to be first. There's such a vast amount of content now that has to be published every day. And I wonder if people just, or magazines or websites, are just not taking the time. Blogs are just not taking the time to check the facts.
Well, I know that time equals money, and everyone's short of money these days. You know, you know, on one hand, I think magazines have the luxury of time over daily news, but I understand that, yeah, fact checking costs money. Time is money, and I think everyone is squeezed. So, yeah, I think there's a bit of a bind there.
Yep, I think budget is a huge aspect, as it always is, and
but you know,
the value of
sometimes it doesn't take a lot of time to ask, how do you know that? You know, sometimes it really just involves asking one or two more questions.
Exactly. And the payoff, I think, for brands that do that is huge. You become the trusted brand. And I imagine for organizations that have a special interest, that becomes even more important, that people believe what you're saying.
Absolutely.
On all your platforms.
By the way, I just looked up this number here. I see from JSource that there are currently 4.1 PR professionals for every journalist in Canada.
Uh-huh.
And I think 20 years ago, that number was reversed.
There's another, you know, trend that has become more marked in recent years, and that is the pivot to content marketing. And that, you know, refers to content that comes from, say, an advertiser, but is presented as in a story form or an article form, whether it's about the advertiser or about something else. How do you feel about that? You know, I think PR has become very sophisticated in terms of how a brand is marketed.
Well, I think, you know, as I say, I started thinking about this critical thinking back when we were thinking about spin and PR, when PR was really starting to overtake journalism, and we were getting more and more spin. You know, follow the money is always, as I said several times already. You know, is someone looking for funding? Is someone looking for an investment? Is someone looking for, you know, donations? What's their agenda? I think, you know, are they trying to get me to buy into something? I think you really have to have your critical thinking guard up all the time when you're dealing with PR. And, you know, this is not to say there aren't some excellent PR people out there. I know lots of former science journalists who are now science communicators for universities, writing press releases about science research. They were good journalists. They're good PR people. But you know, I always try to explain to scientists when I do my training that there's a difference between science journalism and science communication. That science journalism asks critical questions, and science communication is about boosting the science. So journalists are not, you know, we're not into it to boost things, we're into it to question things. And I think that's just something to always keep at the forefront. It doesn't mean you can't write a positive story, of course, but you have to always be critically questioning everything.
Yeah. And you had mentioned, thanks for the plug for Toronto Life and Walrus there at the beginning. Is it, I think those are two magazine brands that are trusted brands. In other magazines that you read, what do you look for?
I was just going to say, I know for a fact that the Walrus and Toronto Life both employ fact checkers and researchers. And I understand not every magazine can afford to do that. But maybe that's why the quality of their journalism is so high.
How do you, when you look at a magazine, how do you decide whether it's one you can trust or not, or any media?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, if it's one I'm not familiar with already.
Mm-hmm.
You're really putting me on the spot here, Penny.
You have to be the average reader,
you know, outside of, yeah. I go a lot by recommendations from people I trust, I guess, which is not always the most reliable thing if you look at Facebook. You know, I go by reputation. Yeah, that's a tricky one. How do you assess whether a magazine or a news source is in fact trustworthy or not?
Mm-hmm.
I guess do some research.
Yeah, and accreditation helps too, I'm sure. You know, when you look and see the sources that are referenced within articles, who the magazine journalists, story writers are talking to themselves. We're just coming up to the top of the hour, and if anybody has any other questions, we probably have time for one more. And
that's good because my voice is virtually gone.
Is virtually gone. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been a lot of fun, and I think this is particularly interesting, as you say, as we go into uh, an election campaign, election this fall, and we'll all be watching with interest and with our little bullshit indicator, whatever it was you said was there. And I appreciate, Jim. Thank you so much for your assistance. This is the first in a series of webinars. We have another one coming up that will be available in October, so check out that. You can find them on Magazines Canada website under webinars. And Jim, I hope that you feel better soon, and thank you again for today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was great.